everyone, and welcome to this Centre for Global Higher Education seminar, which is the second in our series on racism and coloniality in global higher education. My name's Natasha Robinson, and today we're going to be hearing from Professor Crain Soudien on the topic of affirmative action and transformation in higher education in South Africa. Specifically, Professor Soudien will reflect on the case of the University of Cape Town and how the approaches taken by this university have engaged with issues of race and racism. So the topic of affirmative action touches upon some fundamental themes in this series, such as what is a university for, who is it for, and what are its responsibilities in addressing histories of past injustice. The University of Cape Town, as I'm sure many of you know, have lived these questions more than most universities, and I suspect we have much to learn from their experiences and examples. And I think that there's no better person to think through some of the thorny issues relating to affirmative action than Crain Soudien. Until recently, Professor Soudien was the CEO of the Human Sciences Research Council in South Africa. Before taking this role in 2015, he was a Deputy Vice Chancellor at the University of Cape Town, where he remains a joint professor in education and African studies. And he is an honorary professor at Nelson Mandela University as well. He has written extensively on the subject of affirmative action, as well as on other issues relating to education, race, and social justice. We are extremely pleased and grateful to welcome him to speak here with us today. But before we invite him to speak, there are just a few brief housekeeping points that I want to mention. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted online on the CGHE website in due course. A transcript of the chat function conversation will also be posted. Please keep yourself muted unless you've been asked to speak or ask a question. There's no need to have your video on during the webinar, but please do so when asking a question. We recommend using the speaker view so that you can more clearly see who is talking. To ask a question, use the chat function and write out the question you wish to ask. At the end of the presentation, if your question is selected, you will be invited to ask it directly yourself. When invited to ask a question, please unmute yourself, switch on your video, and state your name and where you are from. And finally, we have set up a Padlet for this seminar series where slides, notes, questions, and comments from the speakers and participants can be documented. The link to the Padlet is going to be put in the chat just now, I think. Please feel free to engage with the Padlet either during the seminar or over the next 3 weeks that the seminar series is going to be running. And with those housekeeping issues out of the way, I would now like to pass over to Professor Soudien for today's CGHE seminar. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Natasha. So let me stumble my way through all of this.
Just click. Okay.
Right. Thanks. Thanks very much. And let me say a big thank you to you and Trevor and the colleagues for inviting me to do this, and hello also to everybody online. So what I'm going to do, colleagues, is do a quick overview of South African higher education enrolments in the last 60 years or so. First, I'll then talk briefly about the context for affirmative action in South Africa, and then spend most of my time talking about the what I call the admissions policy moment at UCT, and then make some final reflections. So I'm going to show you a couple of slides here which give you a sense of how this higher education landscape in South Africa has changed over these last 60 years, and it really is quite dramatic. I've said elsewhere that one of the big and unanalyzed, I think, phenomena in our country's recent last 20-year history is this change that has happened in the demographics of around the black middle class. And I won't be paying any attention to that in this particular slide or session, but just to alert you to there's I think a really important set of social formation issues which have arisen in the last while, of which the changes in the university environment are an important dimension. So the big backdrop to be very conscious of here is how these enrolments have changed over this last while. So when we start in 1960, for example, if you go back into the 1950s, and the numbers are even more stark. So if you start in the 1960s, as in this slide here, you'll see that the total enrollment profile in the country was only 39,000 students. Of those 39,000 students, only 4,000 plus were Black. Now simply go to 2008. In 2008, there are already almost 800,000 students in the system. When you get to 2017, there are over 1 million students in the system. And in terms of the demography of South Africa, using these apartheid labels, people classified African were 763,000. And when you get to 2021, there are over 1,100,000 students in the system, and the African participation rate has come up to 16.3%. Now that 16.3% is significant because, and I use this often in the analyses that I do of what's going on in the system. Martin Trowell, the American sociologist, passed away some years ago, classifies systems in terms of their participation rates. And when systems reach what he calls 16%, he says they tip over from being elite systems to mass systems. So this is what has happened in the South African system, and it's significant, particularly in relation to this comment that I made earlier about the black middle class. What does UCT look like? So this is a very sketchy timeline for profile enrollment at UCT. So you start off, by the way, you can take this right back to 111, 112, when the first Black student was admitted into UCT. But in 1968, there were only 411 Black students at UCT, constituting 5.5% of the student complement. Now that by 1993 changes quite significantly when Black enrollments are almost a third of the total enrollment complement. By 2008, Black students are in the majority. 51% of 17,000 students. Yeah, when we get to the current period, I don't have the precise figure now, but it's in the order of about 55–56% students who would be classified as being Black. So the situation has changed quite a lot, but there remain problems, and I'll come to those problems in a second. So, but let's just very quickly talk about affirmative action, because affirmative action is a really important framing concept here to use for talking about UCT's admissions policy. The South African Constitution makes provision for what it calls fair discrimination. And this fair discrimination is to, as it reads there, to promote the achievement of equality, legislative and other measures designed to protect or advance persons or categories of persons disadvantaged by unfair discrimination may be taken. And so that's a really important legislative mandate, if you like. But how it's to be implemented is a matter of great dispute. And there regularly are court cases around particularly employment equity around all of this. There hasn't been, there were almost a few times admissions cases at UCT which were close to becoming cases for legal action against UCT, but it hasn't and it didn't transpire. But as I say, there has always been in the background of how this has evolved at UCT suggestions that somebody or parents in particular would be so unhappy about what has happened that they would contemplate taking legal action against the university. So to roughly this period around about 2008 at UCT. So at that time, there was a lot of focus at the university on racial harassment and sexual harassment. So it's important, I think, to say to everybody that I was very involved in all of that. So, but I need to emphasize here that I'm speaking not on behalf of the university at all. I speak and take full consequences for whatever's said here myself. So at that particular time, we developed a new racial harassment policy alongside of a sexual harassment policy. And that policy committed the institution to the elimination of racism, racial prejudice, and unfair discrimination in its corporate conduct at every level of institutional governance. And for the next 5 years or 6 years, we had a lot of attention paid to what this policy landscape looked like at the university. A particular policy issue which came to attention was this policy around admissions. We had an existing policy at that time, and that policy had been used almost since the first time that UCT began to admit large numbers of Black students. They always could admit Black students, but Black students would come into the university on sufferance. I was a student there on sufferance. When I made my application to UCT, I had to get permission from the so-called Department of Coloured Affairs. So, and there were lots of, people who went through that experience. The policy, as it was in 2008, was an issue. It became an issue because, as the Vice Chancellor then, Max Price, said, if we didn't do something about it, the numbers of Black students who would be eligible to come to the university would not be sufficient, simply because of the legacy of apartheid and how apartheid constituted performance profiles in the high school system. So that policy, that existing policy, essentially worked on the basis of baskets. You had a basket for white students, Black students, African students, coloured students, and Indian students. And people competed in their baskets. And the top students in each basket were admitted into the university. To begin to make it fairer, the university committed itself to a process of consultation around the process and the policy, and the university went into a almost 4 or 5 year long process of consultation, debate, and discussion around this, and it was enormously intense. Sorry, Natasha, I see that my gallery here is overlapping on the screen. Is that the same for you? Because we need to do
So
something
we can move the gallery. Each person can move the gallery individually.
Each person can. Each person watching.
Yes, yes. So we can see it fine.
How do I move it? Because it's in my way. Okay, great. So this was a really intense process, and the university was in itself in fierce and repeated and regular debate, but the debate also spilled out and over into the public domain. It was on the front pages of the major newspapers in the country on a regular basis, and lots of people were pitching in one way or another. Essentially boiled down to two positions. Positions which I characterize here as for race, in other words, to retain the old policy, and so pointedly to keep race as the determining factor, those baskets that I spoke about earlier, and against race, to do away with race in favor of what people began to describe as coming to a better understanding as the direct factors which conditioned a disadvantage. Now, it's important for me to say here that in both of those camps was the whole spectrum, in both of those camps, the whole spectrum of ideological positions. There were liberals in both sides, first of all. There were Marxists on both sides. There were conservatives who, for various reasons, were on both sides. So it's not possible to, in a categorical way, say that this group of people were here and that group of people were here. And so when I describe these positions, it's somewhat messy, and I'd like folks to be very aware of that, because it in some ways reflects a lot of how the discussion in South Africa happens anyway. So those who were for race, as I said, there were liberals, and they self-identified as white, colored, Indian, or African, and very typical comments about racism and restoring people's dignity, and I'll talk about that in a minute. There were Marxists who were not satisfied with the way in which classical Marxism was dealing with the question, particularly rejecting structuralist Marxist explanations, which didn't take proper account of ideology. And importantly, there were nationalists, and they were largely black, and I'll come to those in a minute. I also just briefly need to say here that there were a lot of old-style conservatives, still are, in the discussion, who defend biological essentialism, that black people are not equal to white people. So the black liberals and a former leader of the Democratic Alliance is a really important example. And he says, any view that seeks to deny race will ultimately deny the lived experience of many because of their race. Here's a really important point he makes, which reflects where he's coming from. We don't need to deconstruct race. He accepts the idea of race. We need to deconstruct the stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. So that's essentially where a black liberal like Musi Maimane is. White liberals are a little different. So you have amongst white liberals some understanding of the sociological construction, or rather interpretation of how race is a social construction and so on. But a lot of anxiety about not acknowledging blackness. You have progressive liberals who again understand social construction ideas, but are not happy with the disavowal of racial identity. The Marxists were really interesting, and I would need to do a whole lot more explaining here about how all of this comes to play itself out, but simply to tell everybody that you have a growing view here, and I think Joel Tenzi in the ANC is a really important example, where there's a very big consciousness of what the integrity of blackness is all about. You have very much more militant positions also coming out here, and the EFF in South Africans would understand that better. Very determined to make distinctions between different kinds of oppressions. This is all brought together, by one of the major, if you like, champions of this position at UCT at the time, Xolela Mantu, who writes frequently on and wrote frequently on this topic, and he says, "I accept the multiracial formulation because it seems to me a pragmatic recognition of the racialized identities that no amount of scientific rationality, left liberalism or Marxism can diminish." So there's a big, if you like, sense of wanting to affirm what it means to be black, and arguing that removing removing race in this affirmative action move at UCT is a denial of this blackness. The against race position is also really interesting, and it comes to be most articulately expressed by our former UCT SRC president. Her name is Gwen Ngwenya, and she goes on to become a leading policy theorist inside of the Democratic Alliance. And she is regularly, and she still does this, speaks about what she calls the nonsensicalness of using race. And her argument is essentially that you can get to disadvantage in a direct way without drawing on race itself. If you dealt with all of those things which cause disadvantage, like schooling, she says, where people live, and you corrected those things, you'd be in a way which didn't have to reproduce this idea of race. You'd come to be dealing with the problems of affirmative action in much more effective ways. The interesting point that I want to make here is that she does this without criticizing the idea of race itself, which Neville Alexander, this former sociologist in our South African landscape, does. So he initially begins with the argument that this affirmative action, this reification of race, is what he describes as reverse racism. So that's his position. But he does modulate that a little later on. He takes on a fairly pragmatic position and says, okay, let's accept that the politics of the day require us to implement a policy of affirmative action. But he says, let's do this. If we're going to do it, the only manner in which we would do it under these circumstances of the transition is if we limited it, he says, in time to say 1 or 2 generations, but not more than that. and where he's coming from, of course, is really important to understand, because he asserts the logic of social constructionism and is beginning to try to understand how to implement its politics. He makes the point, that identities are socially constructed. We are not born, and he says this repeatedly in many kinds of places, with race. You are not born with race. And he says identities are therefore contested. The categories, coloured and Bantu, to take two recent South African examples, were and are rejected by many. This rejection is part of the larger social struggle for equality, freedom, dignity, and fair access to the resources of the country. So I come to this. I come to a few concluding slides here, and for the archive, for the historical record, come now to tell you what came out of the process of consultation. The outcome was not unanimous, by no means, but the weight of opinion went with moving away from race. And the Commission of Inquiry that had been set up made as its first recommendation, it said the reliance on race is the proxy for disadvantage. To the extent that this has been the case to date, and to the extent to which the self-declared race category of each applicant informs the calibration of the current admissions basket system in terms of the redress categories and open category, is undesirable. The university should aim to implement a revised admissions policy using alternative markers of disadvantage. A lot of the consultation also went in this direction, and we can talk about those politics if people would like in the discussion segment of the session. And so a new policy was designed, a new policy which is in effect to this day. It hasn't changed significantly since it was adopted in 2014. What it does is essentially come to actually a compromise. So it didn't take on the recommendations of the Commission of Inquiry wholly so. It continued to have race as a factor in determining how these admissions ought to be managed. And it did so by creating three bands through which people could be selected. A first band which was entirely open, which was based only on academic performance. A second band was weighted on which the majority of the admissions were managed, was based on academic performance plus a disadvantage weighting. And that disadvantage weighting, which counted about 10% of your total score, was calculated on the basis of the school that you attended. And so what happens at UCT is that they have lists and lists of every single school in the country, and these schools are categorized according to disadvantage. And when you apply, you say that I came from this school, and that school's classification is then used to help determine this disadvantage level. But also, pardon me, what was taken into consideration was parental level of education, grandparents' level of education, the condition of a household, how many people lived in the household, and so on. The last band was a band which, band 3, which catered for between 10 to 30% of a class, was based on academic performance, your marks, what you got in the school leaving exam, and racial classification. Now, this exercise was a really important exercise because it involved lots of modeling, which hadn't been done anywhere before in the country, and I don't think which has been repeated. So it was a really important research exercise in its own right. So what arises is, as I said, Max Price called it a hybrid race-conscious policy. And I'm quoting from him now. He says it achieves a substantial move away from a reliance on race, in that for most programs, about 80% of the class will be selected on a race-blind basis. He speaks quite eloquently about what that is all about. But then he concludes by saying, yet we have found it necessary to keep race in the policy because at a university like UCT, removing race altogether would be a bad thing at this stage because it would suggest that race no longer matters. So here you have what effectively now has given the guidance, in a sense, to lots of other institutions inside of the country. Lots of other institutions have modeled their admissions on variations of what you have here. It's a really important moment. So last two slides that by way of reflections. So there are a number of important things that come out of this particular exercise. A key issue for me, which for me at the time, and I tried to contribute to this, was to try and say to people that words matter. What words you use matter. The words you use to describe people matter. The word race itself matters. One needs to distinguish the word race from the experience of racism. You know, I'd made the point myself at that particular time that a major confusion which was being perpetuated in this policy, you know, was getting or asking race to explain this experience of racism. I felt that it was really important to be clear that they weren't the same things. When you talk about race, you're talking about a particular thing. You're talking about a social construction. When you talk about racism, you're talking about a social experience, and the two are quite different. So we learned a lot in this particular experience. What I would like to leave with in the seminar is to say that what we learned was empirically distinguishing between named phenomena and their social effects. And you can do the same thing as I've just done with gender in relation to the effects of gender. And it made it easier for us in these modeling exercises to come towards counts, weights, measures in ways that we could defend and justify. Using race was not easy to justify by way of adding to it a weight. One could have come to a number, but the number would be completely arbitrary. But when you came to something like school attended, you could actually go and look at how people's marks came to constitute, in comparison with each other, between white schools and black schools. You could come to see how disadvantage could be measured and assessed quite rigorously. And that was a really important a contribution to be made. What was very clear, however, and this is the last point that I want to make, is that this policy was adopted in 2014. In 2015, Roads Must Fall erupted. And it was quite clear that the clinical nature of this exercise at UCT did not deal with, and it's really important to understand this, the huge big pain that comes with the racism which people experience. So this policy might be technically correct, but it emotionally didn't get to grips with the complexity of what the country was going through. And I think, and I'll make this the last point that I want to make, that in the social sciences, this is where we find ourselves. We have very sophisticated sociological approaches to these questions, but our sociological approaches are unable to deal with the trauma, with black pain. We can't explain black pain. Black pain is not amenable to, either in sociological or psychological terms, easy computation. And we have enormous difficulties, analytic difficulties as a result. So we're in the social sciences, and I make this point provocatively, we're in big trouble, because we can talk about these things, but we can only talk about them in very, what I would call ostensive. Ostensive here means, you talk about the experience and you describe the experience, and you think that description of the experience explains the experience, and it doesn't. And this is where we in the social sciences now find ourselves, and this is the difficulty which processes like affirmative action are going to have wherever they are applied. So I'll stop there, and I hope that it was useful. Thanks very much, Natasha.
Thank you so much, Crain, for that, yeah, really informative and thought-provoking presentation. I have a lot of questions that I would like to ask, but I'm going to draw on some of our audience members first. And I was wondering if you could unmute yourself to ask the first question.
Hello, everyone. Natasha, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you, Craig, for that. That was just so thorough and so rigorous and so honest. I was just awestruck by your presentation, and thank you for that. I wanted to ask you a question about the global context of higher education in South Africa. I'm speaking from Australia, and when we try to think through what's happening in higher education here, especially in terms of disadvantage that we create for Indigenous students, we also try to understand it in the context of global trends. There's, as you would know better than I, there's a global trend towards academic capitalism, towards the embedding of the purposes of higher education and the purposes of transnational capitalism. I'm wondering, for example, the auditing culture, I won't go into it in detail, but that whole complex, massive stuff that's happening all around the world to higher education, and is, I believe, an oppressive force in all national systems. I'm wondering if you see that happening in South Africa. When I'm just about to finish, but when I try to think of that, I think of it as a sort of entwinement of national and global trends. And I'm wondering if you've, what your position on that is. Thank you.
Okay. Got it, Anne. Let's take a few more. Natasha, shall we take a couple more?
So we've got a comment from Vicky Trowler. I was wondering if you would like to come in there, Vicky.
Hi. Thanks, Crain. That was a really evocative presentation. Dragged me right back there, so I'm afraid
you were there.
I'm afraid so for some of it. So I'm afraid all that trauma's come surging right back. But just in your presentation and the revisiting of it, it struck me very much to have echoes of that disagreement between Nancy Fraser and Judith Butler. about whether injustices of recognition could be reduced to injustices of distribution, and whether the sort of notion of racism is being sort of merely cultural rather than it being oppressive in its own right. And I suppose the question is to what extent that kind of framing of it resonates for you, thinking back on it now as some kind of representation of that, the kind of big broad trends in that debate.
Interesting.
Okay.
And then, thank you. Thanks for that. And then we'll take a last question for now, David.
Great, thank you. That was really fascinating, Crain. I really appreciated the sort of nuanced way you presented the positions, almost as if it was a seminar debate. And I just wondered whether, in your final comments, you said, well, look, this debate doesn't capture the emotionality of experiences of racism. And so, would that debate have happened now, post Black Lives Matter? Would the debate be different? And how might that change what happens next at UCT? It just strikes me that, you presented a challenge of social sciences, which is how do we grapple with experience? And that's why we turn to the emotive, to the affective. But what's the challenge for policy? What's going to happen next? Thanks.
Over to you, Crain.
Yeah, okay. Thanks very much, Anne. So yes, of course, South Africa is entirely globalized in that kind of sense. I mean, all those issues that you're talking about are here, but they get challenged, and I think the same goes for you folks in Australia. They get challenged in ways which are sometimes helpful and sometimes not. So, and the only way in which I can begin to illustrate that is through the demand which some particularly students would be making, is to burn the whole thing to the ground. Burn it, right, take the whole thing down and let's start all over again, because it is so contaminated. Global systems are such heavy weights on the future of civilization that there's little in them to be redeemed. I mean, against that, you've got people, and I think all of us are in the situation here now. How do you deal with dominance? How do you pragmatically, how do you in the heat of the moment deal with getting to a next step? And this is where, and I'll put the challenge to all of you. We have to have a conversation globally about wins and gains that are being made everywhere, and how these wins and gains are able to be protected, because every time I've seen an institution make a major move, I have without fail seen with a change of leadership that whole thing being undone and the context being restored to where it had been before. So it really is crucial that we think tactically and strategically now. So I'm going to be very polemical. I'm sorry, Natasha. There's an urgency to be thinking strategically about how to be, and it goes for every single issue in which we are finding ourselves, not least of all climate change. We have to think urgently about how to be able to hold on to the breakthroughs as they happen. And I'll be provocative again and say that right now, organizationally and strategically, there are no recognizable, almost anywhere in the world, vehicles which we can think about, which operate on the sense of changing people's ways of thinking. You know, you've got resistance movements left, right, and centre, but very little to guarantee the longevity of this. So, a really important discussion.
Botar lá dentro, você vai botar lá dentro? Você põe água para mim que eu tô ensinando, por favor. Obrigada.
Sorry. Vicky, I think that's a really, so that discussion, we need to translate and transpose that discussion into lots of different contexts. I mean, that's a really important, that debate between Nancy Fraser and Judith Butler, and I'm not going to answer you in your, you know, conceptual way, which you might be wishing for, but I want to say that you know, it needs to be taken on. David, would the discussion be different? No, I don't think so. You know, I'm watching lots of campaigns around the world, particularly around these questions of race and gender. And I don't think that we are in any organizational, affective, analytic way in any different a situation to where we have been before. The major vectors of our politics remain as they are. I'm particularly myself quite depressed by all of that, you know, and thinking that the inevitablest language of a lot of the ways in which we come, you know, to think about this. So just this morning, you know, I read a review paper around critical race theory. And the review paper begins, it's by Michelle Christian. And she begins by making the comment and saying, we have to recognize that racism is a permanent feature of our culture. And I can't accept that. You know, I really can't. I mean, I wouldn't want to, you know, so we must begin to think, I think, a whole lot more practically about how to get beyond where we are, you know, right now. I wouldn't want to be perpetually in this situation in which we find ourselves. Thanks.
Thanks so much. We have a lot of other questions. So Jean-Lee Farmer, would you like to come in? Is Jean-Lee there? No?
Sorry, thank you. My microphone again wouldn't unmute as on Tuesday. Thank you, Crain, for a very insightful and provocative presentation. I'm also an academic in South Africa at Stellenbosch University, and I only want to agree with you that the undoing as we work towards social good becomes so easily changed, and it's so easily changeable with change of management. But also that to give up the hope that race is a permanent structure in our culture, I just don't see how we're going to get past that. I can write a dissertation, I can write an article about it, but I found myself fighting against race 30 years ago, and now my children are at university and they are still fighting the struggle. I thought that I was fighting the struggle back then so that they wouldn't have to. How do we get beyond that point? How do we get beyond writing dissertations about getting beyond race and working towards social good for everyone? It is really hard in South African institutions to maintain that kind of hope.
Interesting. Thanks, Jean-Lee. Eric Dietrich, would you like to come in with your question?
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you, Crain, for such a fantastic presentation, very thought-provoking. And I'm curious how the UCT case is reflective of the broader context of higher education in South Africa. Some countries, such as Brazil, India, have federalized, to use that word, this policies of affirmative action across their federal universities, for example, although in Brazil, some variation remains at the state universities. But not only the policies themselves, but also the conversation. You know, to what extent was this conversation around disadvantages based on social position, social class, and so forth, particular to UCT versus the conversation about race as an enduring or a sort of let's say one of the factors to take into consideration for this the policies. So was that a broader conversation similar across the rest of South Africa, or was that did it have a different inflection in different parts of the country? So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks. And maybe I can ask the third question, which is, to what extent do you think that these conversations about affirmative action are specific to the specific historical legacies of UCT and South Africa? And to what extent do you think that they could be applied to other institutions, like, for example, Oxford, that have been kind of entangled or actors in this kind of colonial legacy? I think the UK has had some interesting conversations recently about the relationship between race and disadvantage with the Sewell report, for example, and whether we are an institutionally racist country and the role that race plays in disadvantage. And yet Oxford is very occupied or preoccupied with counting how many Black students it enrolls every year. And I'm wondering, kind of almost philosophically, whether you see the kind of conversations happening at UCT as having necessarily a similar route to those happening at Oxford, at an institution like Oxford. Thanks very much.
Okay, so thanks. Let's start with Jean Lee. So I have been speaking here, I think, with a forked tongue. So, and to get us out of it, let me say I'm insistent on historicizing experiences, and would like to think that as a sociologist, I'm always going to do that, to historicize. So the really important thing, Jean Lee, and I'm going to be provocative here, is that we have moved a long way from where we were in the 1950s and the 1960s. And it's really important to recognize that. There's really no resemblance between the way in which structural racism worked in the past to the way in which it works today. And it's coming to understand that, because it's the tricks, it's the wiliness, it's the seductions, you know, it's the feints and the plays that one is needing to be recognizing and to be responding to that is really important, because I think we want to say to our children that it is better, and there's no doubt about it. It's absolutely better. You know, I came to UCT and I wasn't allowed to live on campus, right? I couldn't live in residences. When I became a lecturer there in the 1990s, students said to me, "You're an old, you know, alumnus of UCT. Which residence did you live in?" These were Black students asking me that question. Black students. And I'd like to say that, we have to teach the history of our experiences to people. Because I think that it's in that we come to understand just how the politics of inclusion and exclusion, how these politics might be better engaged with. So, as in all of these societies, the gradual widening of these nets of inclusion, but there remain stubborn problems. And here's my provocation: a really stubborn problem is around Blackness. Our societies cannot deal with Black people. And I'm going to be blunt here. I mean, Black Lives Matter right now is really crucial. And so the UK has to address that. I can't answer you more categorically than that, Natasha. The UK has to address that. It has to address its long 400-year experience of that, and how that has come to configure what UK society is today all about. What UK society today has got every, if you like, connection and bearing in relation to what happened, early on, and it's so complex. And we've got to deal with that complexity, unfortunately. It's awkward. Every time I get into these conversations, it bristles with awkwardness. The tension is almost palpable in the room. And we have to find ways of managing that. So I don't like this thing about safe spaces, because it's both too easy and doesn't get us to dealing with really difficult things, which I think we have to speak about. And then, Eric, your question about is UCT reflective of South Africa? Yes and no. It's reflective in the sense that it's a reflective of privileged spaces. Many privileged spaces in the country are like UCT. Good Blacks are able to go into and come into them and manage. And this is where it's really important to talk about class. We're unable to come to a clear understanding of reality here of how socioeconomics actually, work in people's lives. And a lot of people have prospered in the last 20 years, and a lot of people have not, and they're largely Black. And I think we have to come to understand a much more politicized intersectionality than we have up to now. We have to give intersectionality a lot more of a political edge to it, than we have. Yep.
Thank you so much, and I think that actually brings us to the end. We have 2 minutes left, and so I just want to really thank you, Crain, for a very insightful and provocative beginning to this seminar series, and certainly I think a lot of food for thought. And I mean, I know that the University of Cape Town has gone through a lot in kind of coming to this place, and it's a real privilege to be able to hear about their experiences and some of their learning or unlearning or mislearning as they go along. So just to remind you that this is the second in an 8-part seminar series on race and coloniality in higher education. We hope to see you all next Tuesday for a seminar by Amber Murray and Patricia Daly, a seminar entitled Dismantling the Colonial University, Defiant Scholarship and Decolonial Thought in Africa. That the link to that seminar is now posted in the chat, as well as the Padlet link where you can access Crain's slides as well as other documents and provocations that have been produced by this seminar series. And yes, thank you again, Crain, for your insight and for finishing bang on the dot 3 p.m.
Thanks very much.
Thank you all.
Thank
See you next
everybody.
week.
Thank you.